In 1925, a man walked out of Paris's most expensive hotel with 70,000 francs in his pocket. Payment for the Eiffel Tower. The buyer handed over the money, accepted a receipt on official government stationery, and went home to prepare for his purchase. 3 days later, he realized he'd been conned, and 6 months after that, the same man came back to Paris and sold the Eiffel Tower again. You're listening to The Unlit Room. Every story in here actually happened. That's the part that should scare you. New stories every day, Monday through Saturday. Today, the con man who understood that the best way to sell a monument is to act like you're ashamed of doing it. This episode's narration is AI generated. The research, writing, and editorial decisions behind every story are made with care for accuracy and respect for those involved. 1925. Victor Lustig sat in a Paris cafe reading the morning newspaper. He was 35 years old, 5'7", impeccably dressed in a tailored suit. A 2.5-inch scar ran across his left cheek, a souvenir from a Parisian love rival years earlier. He spoke 5 languages fluently and had used 47 different aliases across Europe and the United States. The article that caught his attention was about the Eiffel Tower. The 36-year-old landmark was falling into disrepair. The cost of repainting it, of maintaining the massive iron structure, was mounting every year. The article mentioned, almost in passing, that some Parisians had suggested the tower might be better removed entirely. It had been built for the 1889 World's Fair, after all. It was never meant to be permanent. Lustig folded the newspaper and paid for his coffee. He'd just found his next mark. Within days, Lustig commissioned fake government stationery. It was high-quality work, thick paper stock, the official French government seal embossed at the top. The letterhead read, Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs. Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs. He checked into the Hôtel de Crillon, a stone palace on the Place de la Concorde. It was one of the most expensive hotels in Paris, the kind of place where only government officials and the very wealthy stayed. He introduced himself as the Deputy Director General of the Ministry. His rooms overlooked the square, his clothing was immaculate, and within a week, 5 carefully selected scrap metal dealers received confidential invitations to a private meeting at the hotel. The invitations were typed on the forged letterhead. They emphasized discretion. They mentioned a matter of national importance that required the participation of reputable businessmen. Each dealer was chosen for his standing in the Paris business community. Men who'd built their reputations on solid work, men who wouldn't want to risk embarrassment by asking too many questions. The Eiffel Tower, at that moment, was both the most famous landmark in Paris and the subject of genuine public debate. It didn't fit with the Gothic cathedrals or the Arc de Triomphe. Gustave Eiffel had designed it as a temporary exhibit for the World's Fair. 20 years had turned into 36, and maintenance costs were real. Lustig hadn't invented the controversy. He'd just read the same newspapers everyone else had, and understood that the best lies are the ones people are already halfway ready to believe. Micro cliffhanger 1. The dealers arrived at the Crillon on the appointed day. They sat in a quiet private room. Lustig greeted each man by name. What he told them next would determine whether they'd leave the room as businessmen with the deal of a lifetime, or as marks who'd never report what happened. Lustig began with an apology. He explained that the French government had made a difficult decision. The Eiffel Tower's maintenance costs had become unsustainable. The structure was an embarrassment, a temporary exhibit that had overstayed its welcome. The government wished to dismantle it and sell it for scrap metal. But there was a problem. The decision was politically sensitive. Announcing it publicly would spark outrage. The government needed a buyer before the public announcement, someone who could take delivery of the metal discreetly without drawing attention. That's why, Lustig explained, the dealers had been invited. They'd been selected carefully. They were men of integrity, men who could be trusted to handle a confidential transaction. He handed out sealed envelopes. Inside each was a formal bid packet, specifications for the tower's metal content, guidelines for submitting offers, a deadline for responses. The paperwork looked official because it was. Lustig had studied real government procurement documents and replicated the format exactly. The dealers asked questions. Lustig answered each one with the kind of specific bureaucratic detail that only someone inside the government would know. He mentioned the ministry's budget shortfalls. He cited the tower's weight, 7,000 tons of wrought iron, and estimated scrap value. He acknowledged that dismantling would take months, maybe a year. He emphasized again that everything must remain confidential until the final contracts were signed. One of the dealers, André Poisson, listened more carefully than the others. He was newer to Paris's business elite, less established. He wanted this deal more than he should have. And Lustig noticed. Poisson was exactly the kind of mark Lustig had built his career on. Insecure, ambitious, desperate to prove himself to the Parisian business circles he so badly wanted to join. A man like that wouldn't ask hard questions, because asking questions would mean admitting he didn't already know the answers. Lustig didn't need to outsmart Poisson, he just needed to let Poisson outsmart himself. Micro cliffhanger 2. The dealers left the Crillon with their bid packets. Over the next week, they prepared their offers. But Lustig had already decided who would win. He invited André Poisson to a second private meeting. What happened in that meeting would be the real scam, and Poisson would pay for the privilege. The second meeting was quieter. Just Lustig and Poisson in a private room at the Crillon. Poisson had prepared his bid. He'd calculated the scrap value, factored in dismantling costs, and submitted a number he believed was competitive. Lustig reviewed the paperwork and nodded approvingly. Then he leaned forward. His tone changed, still professional, but now conspiratorial. He told Poisson something he hadn't shared with the other dealers. He was a government official, yes, but his salary didn't support the lifestyle he wished to enjoy. He'd selected Poisson's bid carefully, not because it was the highest, but because Poisson was the kind of businessman who understood how things really worked in Paris. A man who knew that sometimes the official bid wasn't the only payment required. Poisson understood immediately. Lustig was asking for a bribe. For most people, this would have been the moment to walk away. A corrupt official demanding money under the table, a deal that suddenly smelled wrong. But for Poisson, the bribe made the whole thing more believable. Of course, a government official would be corrupt. Of course, there was a price beyond the bid. That's how Paris worked. That's how deals got done. Poisson agreed. He paid approximately 70,000 francs for the purchase of the Eiffel Tower, the bid price. Then he paid the bribe directly to Lustig in cash. Lustig accepted the money. He provided Poisson with a receipt on official government letterhead. He assured him that the final contracts would be delivered within the week, once the ministry completed the internal approvals. Then Victor Lustig checked out of the Hôtel de Crillon, boarded a train, and left Paris for Austria. He never sent the contracts. There were no contracts. There was no government approval. There was only 70,000 francs and a train ticket east. Poisson had paid a fortune for a monument he could never own, and now he faced a choice that would define everything that came next: report the scam to the police or stay silent. André Poisson chose silence. He realized, of course, that he'd been conned. No government contracts arrived, no ministry officials contacted him. The man he'd met at the Crillon, the deputy director general, didn't exist. But Poisson couldn't bring himself to report it. The humiliation would be unbearable. He'd have to stand in front of the Paris police and admit that he'd paid 70,000 francs to a stranger for the Eiffel Tower without verifying a single detail. He'd become a joke among the very people whose respect he'd been trying to earn. So he stayed quiet. He absorbed the loss. He told no one. And from Austria, Victor Lustig watched the French newspapers. Day after day, he searched for any mention of the scam. There was nothing. No police investigation, no public outcry, no mention of a con man selling the Eiffel Tower, which meant the coast was clear. 6 months later, Lustig returned to Paris. He checked into a different hotel, used a different name, and ran the exact same con. New letterhead, new scrap dealers, new confidential meeting, same story about the government selling the Eiffel Tower for scrap. This time, the buyer reported the scam to the police. Lustig learned that investigators were asking questions. He fled Paris before they could arrest him. He crossed into the United States and never returned to France. He was never prosecuted for selling the Eiffel Tower, twice. The French authorities had no case. Poisson's silence had protected Louis Tig the first time, and by the time the second victim came forward, Louis Tig was already gone. He went on to run scams across the United States for another decade: the Romanian box, counterfeit currency operations, fake horse race schemes. In 1935, federal agents arrested him in New York for counterfeiting. He was convicted, sentenced to 20 years, and sent to Alcatraz. He died in a federal medical facility in Springfield, Missouri, on March 11, 1947. He was 57 years old. He never faced charges for the Eiffel Tower. The scam that made him famous was the one crime he got away with. Victor Lustig didn't sell the Eiffel Tower because he was brilliant. He sold it because André Poisson wanted to believe. Poisson wanted the deal so badly that he ignored every warning sign. And when Lustig added the bribe, the moment that should have ended the con, it became the detail that made it all feel real. The best cons don't trick people. They invite people to trick themselves. And embarrassment, it turns out, protects a con man better than any escape plan ever could. Poisson's shame was Lustig's insurance policy. The scam succeeded not because Lustig was a genius, but because he understood that humiliation is more powerful than greed. If this one kept you up tonight, good. New stories every day, Monday through Saturday. Subscribe so the next one finds you too. Follow the Unlit Room wherever you listen. Tell a friend who can't sleep. Full story on the main channel. Follow if you're wide awake. That was the Unlit Room. See you in the dark.